to click or not to click? This is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and in opposing end them, to live, to sleep in boredom. Hello, I'm here today to talk about self-control and temptation in 2020, in this new environment that we find ourselves in. And my little play here on Hamlet was really meant to illustrate this enduring, pressing dilemma that we face. The temptations constantly being pushed to us on our phones. We have to navigate this cornucopia of opportunities. And how do we go about doing that? I'd like to start by going to a cult classic, Forrest Gump. You may have seen it. Forrest Gump, he says that life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Well, your phone is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to see. Someone liked your post. Someone shared something. Or maybe you got the special news update. The temptations abound. I will take this a step further. It's not actually like our phone is just a box of chocolates, because we're actually in this box of chocolates when you think about it. Our phones, our computers, our tablets, our devices, even our watches are all connected. And the temptations, they never get stale. They are there, constantly updated, constantly refreshed, constantly delicious. I would like to take this metaphor a step farther. This is a Skinner box. About a century ago, Skinner and colleagues, these were behaviorist psychologists, they would put pigeons, rats, in these boxes and feed them rewards. And by doing so, they would study them, manipulate them. It was amazing what kind of patterns they could induce in the pigeons in these Skinner boxes. This is why I would say that today, we are actually in a digital Skinner box. We're constantly being fed temptations, we're being fed rewards, and we are being influenced. If you think about it, every step you take, every click you make, they are watching you. Socrates was walking about 2,500 years ago, according to Plato, and he would ask, how is it that people can act against their better judgment? This was the big question back then, 2,500 years ago. Well, I'm pretty sure if he were walking around here today, his question would rather be, how is it that people cannot act against their better judgment? And this is what I would like to focus a little bit on today. There's a lot that can be said about temptations, digital temptations in particular, and you will hear a lot about it in the media, about legislation, about regulation. But what I would like to focus on here is a little bit more on what we can do about it ourselves. How can we muster our own mental resources to deal with these temptations, this cornucopia of temptations that we're facing? And I think it's useful to start with the classic tools of the trade, if you will, if you consider self-control. One being willpower. This is probably the brute force of will. This is probably the tool that we're most familiar with. So willpower, we have that at our disposal. And it can be great. It can be very useful. And you can think about it a little bit like a muscle. You can train your willpower and it will get stronger. But the problem is that after you exert it a lot, just like your muscle, after heavy exertion, it gets tired. And that means that when you're in this environment, in this digital environment, where temptations abound, where you're carpet bombed with temptations, it's going to be very difficult for you to fight them all off, unless perhaps you're Bruce Lee. Now, there is a second opportunity here. There's a second technique, and that is the pre-commitment, or you could call it the preemption tactic. So this involves anticipating in advance what temptations loom around the corners, and then try to think about strategies for dealing with that. The classic example of the preemption strategy is that of Ulysses and the sirens. So Ulysses is out sailing and he really wants to hear the song of the sirens. But the problem is he knows that he cannot resist their song. And if he hears their song, that will imply certain death. He will swim to their island and they will devour him. So he devises this ingenious scheme. He asks his sailors to bind him to the mast and to put earwax into their own ears so that they can sail past the island of the sirens and he can hear their song, but he would be unable to act on the temptation. Now, if we think a little bit about this, there are many modern versions of this pre-commitment strategy. When you're out working, you could, for example, position yourself in an environment where there is no Wi-Fi or there are weak phone signals. You could turn off push notifications on your phones. You could delete your most tempting apps. You could also, for example, use Apple's screen time. This is actually software that's specially designed to manage the amount of time you devote to various apps. So these opportunities exist, and they are great. But the problem is, the pre-commitment strategies requires that you are able to anticipate the temptations in advance. And they also require that you're able to accurately forecast your ability to deal with the temptations should they arise. The problem here, of course, is that we tend to be a bit overconfident, right? We like to think we're more like Bruce Lee than we actually are. So there is a third category of tactics we can use to deal with temptations, and that deals with how we change our representation of the temptation. We can try to think about the temptation in different terms, in more abstract terms, by cooling the temptation. The classic example of this would be the marshmallow test developed by Walter Mischel and colleagues. And in this marshmallow test, you have the children were put into an experiment where they were given a marshmallow, just like this, and if they were able to wait and not eat that marshmallow immediately, they would get more marshmallows. And in these experiments, you film the children and you could see how they would react. There are great videos online. They would be looking away. They would be doing all kinds of things to try to make that tempting marshmallow a bit less tempting. And one of the techniques that we found that many people developed to deal with this marshmallow was to represent it in different terms, to think about it perhaps more as a cloud than as a marshmallow. So by doing this, it will become more abstract and less tempting. But this technique too has some limitations. One of them being that cooling the temptation, this really requires a bit of your attention. And our digital temptations, they are by their very nature extremely distracting. The second problem here is that you need to actually see that you should resist these temptations here in the first place. The thing is, that's not always obvious. Take this gentleman, Cookie Monster. For Cookie Monster, cookies are always pure goodness. Cookies are wonderful. He never sees any reason to resist. Why should he resist the temptations? There's no problem eating a cookie. And if you think about a lot of the digital temptations that we face, the likes, the updates, the shares, many of these, they are similar. Those digital temptations are to us like those cookies are to Cookie Monster. We are, in a sense, digital cookie monsters. So let's consider this situation. I'm sure many of us have experienced it. You're watching your favorite show, and it's coming to an end on your favorite streaming device. And as you're watching it, you start to see, in the lower hand corner, the next episode begins in 3, 2, 1 seconds. Of course, this is happening so quickly that you usually cannot muster thoughts to resist. But suppose you can. Suppose you are able to feel some thoughts here. You might ask yourself, okay, the next episode's about to begin here. Should I resist? Is there really a problem here? most of the time, there isn't much of a problem, right? It's just one more episode. What harm will that cause? It might make you a little more tired tomorrow. It might mean that you're not getting all your work done. But you can do your work later, and you'll deal with being a little bit tired, right? Seeing the temptation in these terms, you're going to lean back, you're going to watch this show, and you're going to indulge. But now suppose you looked at this situation from a slightly different angle. Suppose you instead ask yourself, is binge watching shows something I do on weekdays? Am I the kind of person who spends hours on weekdays watching TV shows? Is this who I am? Is this part of my plan? If you take this perspective instead, you might see that there is a self-control problem here. You might see that there's a problem with the temptation. And seeing the problem, that is a precondition for doing something about it. You've probably been to Vegas, or if you haven't, you've certainly heard the slogan, right? What happens here stays here. This is a brilliant marketing campaign. And if we think about it, what is this campaign actually doing? It's undermining your broad view of the temptation here, right? What happens here stays here. What are they really saying? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. They're saying, you come to Vegas and you think about all the great stuff you can do here in Vegas. You should only think about that because you're here in Vegas. What you're doing here, it does not represent who you are. And it most definitely does not represent who you aspire to be. This is exactly the kind of mindset that you want to avoid in the digital sphere. As you know, what happens on your phone doesn't necessarily stay on your phone. So, as I wrap up here, I'd like to add a few thoughts about thinking about the broader frame when you're considering tempting situations. It is really useful to have clear goals. It is really useful to have a sense of self-awareness. Because by having that, this allows you to ask the question the next time you're watching your favorite episode and it's ending on a cliffhanger and this little text on the lower hand corner says the next episode is going to begin in 3, 2, 1 seconds. It allows you to ask, is this part of the plan? Is this who I am? Thank you very much.